The rear axle of Martha Maddox's wagon snapped clean in two on a Tuesday morning in late September of 1873, somewhere in the vast and indifferent wilderness of the Wyoming Territory, and she stood in the rising dust of that catastrophe with nothing more than a canteen of warm water, a loaded rifle, and the stubborn refusal to weep. She had been traveling alone for 11 days by that point, which was 11 days longer than most people in the town of Laramie had thought she would last. They had said it plainly, without cruelty but without much charity either, standing on the wooden boardwalks of that rough-hewn settlement, and watching her load her wagon with dry goods, and a hope that felt reckless in the amber light of a September afternoon. Widow Hollis, the postmistress, had taken Martha by the arm and said, with genuine concern creasing her weathered face, that a woman alone had no business crossing open country to reach a homestead 3 days' ride north of Buckhorn Creek. Martha had thanked her politely, finished loading the wagon, and driven out of Laramie without looking back once. She was 28 years old, recently widowed, and in possession of 40 acres of land that her late husband, Thomas Maddox, had filed on before a fever took him in the spring. The land was hers by right of his will, and she intended to reach it, work it, and make something of it, because there was nothing left for her in Laramie and nothing pulling her back east and nowhere else in this entire country that belonged to her. Thomas had been a good man. Quiet, earnest, with the kind of patience that made him good with horses and difficult situations. She had loved him in the steady, uncomplicated way that two people who respect each other deeply can love, and his death had left a hollow in her that she had filled, as best she could, with practicality and forward motion. Grief, she had found, was something you carried best when you kept walking. But the axle had stopped all walking, and now she stood in the shortgrass prairie with the Rocky Mountains rising blue and enormous to the west, staring at the broken wood and bent iron beneath her wagon's rear end, doing the mathematics of her situation with the careful, unhurried mind of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford. The axle had cracked somewhere in the small hours of the night, she suspected, weakened by the rocky crossing she had made over a dry creek bed the previous afternoon. It had held through the morning, and then, on a perfectly flat stretch of ground as if mocking her, it had finally given way. The right rear wheel was tilted at a forlorn angle, and the wagon bed had dropped to within inches of the earth on that side, spilling a sack of cornmeal and tipping over a crate of preserves, 2 of which had shattered in a sticky, fragrant mess on the ground. She spent the first hour assessing the damage properly, crawling under the wagon with a practical absence of concern for the dust it put in her dark hair, examining the brake and the iron fitting that had also twisted loose. The axle itself was shattered in the middle, a clean fracture, and she did not have a spare. She had thought about carrying one, had in fact asked the wagon smith in Laramie about it, and he had told her that a spare axle would add significant weight, and that the axle she had was good hardwood, white oak, well seasoned, and she would not need it. She had taken him at his word because he was the expert and she was not, and she did not waste time resenting that decision now. It simply was what it was. She had tools. Thomas had believed in good tools, and she had packed every one of his carefully, wrapping them in oilcloth to keep the rust away. She had an adze and a hand saw and a good iron hammer and a collection of nails and bolts of various sizes. What she did not have was the raw timber needed for an axle, nor the proper ironwork to set it, nor, if she was being truthful with herself, the precise woodworking skill to shape one even if she had the materials. The land around her offered little in the way of help. She was in open country, the prairie stretching broad and dry in every direction, with a line of cottonwoods maybe half a mile to the east that suggested a creek, and to the north, perhaps 2 miles distant, the dark edge of a pine forest climbing toward the mountains. She could see no roads, no buildings, no smoke from any fire. The sky above her was the hard, brilliant blue of high autumn in Wyoming, and a hawk turned in lazy circles far above, unconcerned with her troubles. She made a thorough inventory of her food and water. She had sufficient provisions for perhaps 10 days of careful rationing, which was enough, and her water barrel was 2/3 full from the creek she had crossed that morning. Her 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare named Clover and a younger roan gelding she called Copper, were unhitched and grazing on the short grass nearby, tied on long leads to the wagon's tongue. She considered her options with the methodical clarity she had cultivated over years of managing a household in circumstances that rarely went entirely to plan. She could ride Clover toward the mountains, following what she believed to be the general direction of the nearest settlement, which was a small supply post called Buckhorn Creek. But Buckhorn Creek was 3 days' ride under good conditions, possibly 4, and leaving the wagon and all her supplies unattended on the open prairie for that length of time felt like an invitation to disaster. Wolves would be at her food stores. Weather could turn savage without warning in the Wyoming mountains. And she had no certainty, setting out alone on a single horse into country she did not know perfectly, that she would find Buckhorn Creek at all. She could also simply wait. Someone might come along. The route she was traveling was not a major trail, but it was not entirely unknown either. A rancher, a freighter, a passing traveler of some kind might appear within a day or two. Waiting felt passive in a way that was uncomfortable to her nature, but it was not without logic. She set up a proper camp, which was something she could do and do well, and decided she would give it 2 full days before she made the harder choice of riding for help. She unhitched the horses properly and picketed them where the grass was good, built a fire with the dry buffalo chips she had been collecting and saving in a bag since eastern Wyoming, and made herself a decent supper of salt pork and cornbread from the spilled but largely salvageable sack of cornmeal, eating it sitting on a crate beside her broken wagon as the sun went down over the mountains in colors so extravagant and lovely that it seemed almost impolite, given the circumstances. She slept with the rifle across her chest, as she had slept every night on this journey, and the coyotes sang their wild, wavering song somewhere out in the dark, and the horses shifted and blew softly on their pickets, and the fire burned down to cherry-red coals, and Martha Maddox slept deeply and without dreams. She woke on the second morning to the horses being uneasy. Not frightened exactly, but alert in the particular way horses are when they sense something the human mind has not yet registered. Clover was standing with her head up and her nostrils working, ears pointing in one direction. Copper had stopped grazing and was watching the northern tree line with the focused attention of a prey animal deciding whether to run. Martha was on her feet with the rifle in her hands before she was fully awake, which was a habit Thomas had drilled into her because, as he had said, the frontier does not wait for you to gather your wits. She stood listening. The morning was cool and absolutely still, the way Wyoming mornings are at the edge of October when the seasons are turning their great wheel. The grass was silver with dew. The sky was still the soft gray of early dawn, with a band of pale gold along the eastern horizon. Then she heard it. A horse moving through the timber to the north, unhurried with the rolling, easy stride of an animal that knew the country and was not particularly concerned. One horse. One rider then, or possibly a pack animal traveling loose, though that was less likely. She kept the rifle at a ready position, not raised and aimed but not slung either, and she waited, watching the tree line. The rider came out of the pines and into the open country without hesitation, as if he had known exactly where he was going and had been going there for some time. He was on a large gray horse, a mountain-bred animal by the look of it, and he was leading a second horse, a dark brown mule, which was loaded with packs that looked well-organized and carefully balanced. The man himself was large, broader than most men Martha had encountered, wearing a heavy canvas coat and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen years of hard use. He had a dark beard, trimmed closer than a mountain man's beard in the old trapper tradition, and even from a distance she could see that he moved on his horse with the complete ease of someone who spent the majority of his life in the saddle. He had seen her. He had seen her before she had seen him, she suspected, given the way he was riding directly toward her without any hesitation or alteration of direction. He did not hurry, and he did not slow, and he rode with the particular calm of a man who had encountered most things the wilderness could produce, and had learned not to be surprised by any of them. Martha kept her grip on the rifle but did not raise it. She reminded herself, on open country that did not belong to anyone in particular, and a lone rider was not, by himself, a threat. Plenty of decent men traveled these routes. The fact that she was alone and vulnerable did not mean the world was entirely composed of people who would exploit that vulnerability. He pulled up his gray horse about 20 feet from her and looked at the wagon, at her, and at the tilted rear wheel in that order with the same expression throughout, which was no expression at all. His eyes were a pale, clear color that she later decided was somewhere between gray and green, and they were intelligent eyes, observant in the way that people who live alone in wilderness learn to be observant, cataloging information with a thoroughness that was not unfriendly but was very direct. He said nothing for a long moment. She said nothing either. He swung down from the gray horse in one motion, looped the reins over the saddle horn in the way of a man whose horse would stand without being tied, and walked to the tilted wheel. He crouched down and looked under the wagon at the broken axle with the same focused attention a doctor might give an injury. He looked at it for a good 30 seconds, said nothing, then stood and walked to his mule, where he began to unpack, with deliberate and efficient movements, an assortment of tools and materials. Martha watched him do this with a mixture of relief and wariness, and something she could not quite name, something that had to do with the competence in every movement he made, the complete absence of fuss or performance. "I have not asked for your help," she said. He glanced at her over his shoulder, not with irritation but with something closer to acknowledgement, and then returned to unpacking his mule. She stood there for another moment, watching him pull out a length of what appeared to be well-seasoned hardwood, roughly axle diameter, from beneath the mule's packs with the careful ease of someone who had placed it there specifically. "Do you have much to say for yourself?" she asked. He set the length of wood down, picked up an adze and looked at it for a moment, and then he looked at her, and for the first time his expression shifted very slightly, a movement at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile but had some of the ingredients of one. "I do not say much," he said. His voice was low and unhurried, with a quality like water moving over flat stones, not unpleasant at all. "But I can fix your axle." He said it without arrogance, as a simple statement of fact. Martha Maddox stood there with her rifle and looked at this large, quiet man preparing to repair her wagon in the middle of the Wyoming wilderness, and she made the practical decision that was also, she would later think, the most significant decision of her life. She lowered the rifle and said, "All right." His name was Elias Wallace, and she learned it not because he volunteered it but because she asked him directly, sitting on her crate drinking coffee she had made over her small fire while he worked with a focused intensity that was entirely self-contained. He was 33 years old, which he told her without apparent interest in the subject. He had been living in the Wyoming territory for 7 years, mostly in the mountains to the west, trapping and hunting, and doing occasional work for the ranchers in the valley country when he needed supplies or cash money. He had a cabin, he told her, up a particular canyon whose name she did not know, 2 days' ride into the mountains. He had been coming down to the valley to take some pelts to the trading post at Buckhorn Creek when he had seen her wagon and her fire from the high ground at the tree line the previous evening. He had made camp in the timber rather than approach a lone traveler's fire in the darkness, because that was the decent thing to do, and had come down in the morning. He told her all of this in short, plain sentences while he worked, not looking at her much, answering her questions with the same efficiency he brought to everything else. He had carried the axle wood because he always carried spare timber on long trips, a habit learned from years of situations where something needed fixing and nothing was available to fix it with. "You always carry spare axle timber?" she asked. He paused in his work and looked at the piece of wood he was shaping with the adze. "Not usually axle timber specifically," he said. "Good hardwood can be cut to what is needed." Martha watched him work through the morning, asking occasional questions that he answered and sometimes did not answer, and slowly the shape of his life assembled itself in her mind. He was not unfriendly, she decided, but he had spent so much time alone that the social machinery most people kept running through constant use had in him gone quiet from disuse. He was not rude. He was simply unadorned, stripped of the conversational habits that most people use to fill silence and smooth over the rough edges of proximity. She found, somewhat to her surprise, that she did not find his silence uncomfortable. Thomas had been a talker, an amiable and pleasant talker, and she had loved that about him, but she had also always had a private capacity for quietness, a part of herself that was content in stillness. Elias Wallace's silence was not hostile or empty. It had a quality to it, a density, the way deep water is not the same as shallow water even when the surface looks the same. She made more coffee and set a plate of cornbread near him, which he ate without comment but ate completely, and she took that for what it was. By midday he had the old axle removed and the new one roughed out, and he was fitting it with careful precision, checking the alignment repeatedly, making small adjustments with a patience that impressed her. The work was slow because it needed to be slow, because a poorly fitted axle was worse than no axle, and he knew this without her having to say so. "Where are you headed?" he asked. It was the first question he had put to her, and she noticed that it came late after he had been working for hours, as if he had been deciding whether to ask it. 40 acres north of Buckhorn Creek," she said. "My late husband filed on it, Thomas Maddox. He died in the spring." He was silent for a moment, working with a chisel and mallet on the fitting. "I am sorry," he said. "Thank you." She meant it, but she said it simply, the way he said things simply, and she saw something register on his face at that, a recognition of some kind. "Going there alone?" he asked. "I am going there alone," she said. "I intend to work the land." He looked at the land around them, and then back at his work, and made no comment on whether he thought this was wise or foolish, which she appreciated more than she could easily explain. The afternoon moved along with the particular brightness of late September in Wyoming, the light gold and clear, and somehow thinner than summer light, carrying with it the suggestion of winter coming. The mountains to the west were losing their green above the tree line, and the high peaks had a dusting of snow that had not been there 2 weeks ago. The air smelled of grass and sage and the faint clean cold of altitude. By late afternoon, the axle was fitted, and he had her help him with the lifting and setting, which required 2 pairs of hands, and she put her shoulder to it without being asked, because she was not a woman who needed to be asked twice to do work, and together they managed it without great difficulty, though it was heavy work and left her arms aching pleasantly. He checked the wheel alignment, had her lead Clover slowly in a circle to test the way the wagon tracked, and made one further adjustment to the fitting before he pronounced it done, which he did not do with any ceremony but simply by standing up and putting his tools back into their places on the mule's packs. "That will hold," he said. "How far does it need to take me?" she asked. "Buckhorn Creek is 3 days from here in a wagon," he said. "That axle will take you to Buckhorn Creek and a good deal further." She looked at him standing there in the late afternoon light, this large, quiet man who had ridden out of the mountains and fixed her wagon without being asked or thanked or paid, and she was struck, suddenly and without warning, by a feeling she had not expected. Not just gratitude. Something more complicated and less manageable than gratitude. Something that had to do with the steadiness of him, the complete lack of theatrics, the way he had simply looked at a problem and solved it because it was a problem that needed solving and he had the means to solve it. "What do I owe you?" she asked. He shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "A man's labor and materials are worth something," she said. "I will not take charity." He looked at her. "It is not charity," he said. "I had the wood, I had the time. A woman alone on this country should not be left with a broken wagon." "Then I owe you the same in a different currency," she said. "Stay for supper." He considered this with the same careful attention he had given the axle fitting. Then he nodded once and began to see to his horses. She made the best meal she could from her provisions, which was not lavish but was good: salt pork and beans cooked with a bit of onion and some dried herbs she carried, more cornbread and good strong coffee. And she set it out properly on the tailgate of the wagon, because she had not yet forgotten that she was a woman of some household standards, even in the middle of nowhere. They ate facing the mountains while the sun dropped, and the sky turned colors she could not have named in any language she knew. He ate with appreciation, not just hunger, and he said the beans were well seasoned, which she recognized as high praise from a man who clearly chose his words with extreme care. "What do you do for company?" she asked. "In your cabin up that canyon." He thought about this for a moment. "I read," he said. "I have books." She had not expected that, and he must have seen it in her expression, because something passed briefly across his face that might have been amusement. "What books?" she asked. "Dickens," he said. "Scott, some history, whatever I can find at the trading post or convince freight travelers to part with." She told him she had brought books herself, 3 of them, which she considered the minimum necessary for any journey of any length, and he asked what they were, and she told him she had Middlemarch, which she had read twice, a volume of poetry by Tennyson, and a natural history of North American birds that Thomas had ordered from a catalog and never lived to read. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said he had not read George Eliot, which surprised him somewhat, and she told him it was worth the time. "I could leave it with you," she said. "When you reach Buckhorn Creek, you could return it to the postmaster, and I can collect it when I come to town." He looked at her. "You are planning to come to town regularly." "I am planning to homestead, not to vanish," she said. "A person needs supplies, news, human contact of some kind, however limited." The last sentence came out with an edge she had not planned, and she saw him absorb it without defensiveness, turning it over in that careful way of his. "Buckhorn Creek is not much," he said, "as towns go. It is all there is, and it will serve." He nodded, and they sat in the comfortable and somewhat surprising silence of 2 people who have worked together through a day and arrived at a kind of ease. She told him about Thomas, about the land claim, about what she intended to do with the 40 acres, which was to build a proper house and plant a kitchen garden and eventually, if the soil was good enough, a small grain crop. She told him about Laramie and the people who had told her not to go. She told him about driving out of Laramie with the sun behind her and the feeling of having stepped off a cliff, terrifying and necessary. He listened without interrupting, which was something she had not found men often capable of doing, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "The land north of Buckhorn Creek is good land. The soil along the creek bottom is black and deep. Good for gardens." She looked at him. "You know that country. I have trapped up the creek many times," he said. "I know where every creek and spring in 40 miles runs." "Then you know my 40 acres." He thought for a moment. "Probably," he said. "If it is the southwest quarter section nearest the bend of the North Fork, I know it well." "That is it exactly," she said. Something changed in his expression then, very subtly, a kind of recognition combined with something else she could not read precisely. "That is good land," he said. "There is a spring on the upper end and good timber for building on the slope above the bottom land. Whoever filed on it knew what he was doing." "Thomas was careful when he chose it," she said softly. "He was always careful." Elias Wallace looked at the mountains in the last of the light and said nothing more, but the silence was the kind that acknowledges something without pretending to resolve it. He made his camp nearby, close enough that she felt the safety of a second presence without feeling that he had imposed himself upon her space. and she went asleep that second night with the particular peace of someone whose situation has changed materially for the better. In the morning she was up early and he was already building her fire, which she discovered when she climbed out of the wagon, and she stood looking at him for a moment before he heard her and turned. "You did not need to do that," she said. "You were still sleeping," he said. "Coffee will be ready in a few minutes." She stood there in the early morning cold with her shawl around her shoulders and the horses breathing steam on their pickets, and thought that there was something deeply, almost dangerously comfortable about this man's way of doing things. "Are you continuing to Buckhorn Creek?" she asked. "Yes," he said. He handed her a cup of coffee, and their fingers touched briefly in the transfer, just for a moment, and it was nothing remarkable except that she was aware of it in a way that she had not been aware of small things in a long time. "Then perhaps you would ride along," she said, "if your route takes you that way." He looked at the mountains, then at her. "My route takes me that way," he said. They traveled together through the morning, her wagon moving at the steady walk that was all a loaded wagon could manage on prairie ground, and he rode beside her on the gray horse with an ease that suggested he had long ago given up being in any hurry about anything. They talked more than they had the day before, in the gradual way of two people who are getting accustomed to each other's company, and she learned more of his history, which he revealed in the same way he did everything, efficiently and without embellishment. He had come west from Ohio, where he had grown up on a farm. His father had been a farmer and expected him to be one too, but he had found that he was not built for the settled life, that the horizon always called him more powerfully than the security of a known place. He had gone west at 22, had worked for a time on a cattle drive out of Texas, which was brutal work done by hard men for small pay, and had drifted into the mountains on the strength of a feeling he could not articulate, except to say that when he was among them, he felt like himself in a way he did not feel anywhere else. He had learned the trapping and hunting trade from an old French-Canadian trapper named Levesque, who had been working the Rockies since before the great fur trade had collapsed, a man of extraordinary skill and minimal words who had taken Elias on partly because he was useful and partly because he had, as Levesque had put it in his broken English, the right kind of quiet in him for this work. Levesque had died 4 years ago, an ordinary death from a winter fever, and Elias had buried him in a high meadow he had loved and continued alone. He had been alone since. Martha did not ask why, because she could feel that the question had edges on it, but she thought about it as they rode through the shortgrass prairie toward the distant green-black line of the foothills. "Did you always plan to stay alone?" she asked. He looked at the horizon for a moment. "I did not plan much," he said. "I found the life and it suited me. I did not think much beyond that." "And now?" she asked, and then wondered why she had asked it, because it was more pointed a question than she had intended. He looked at her. The pale eyes were direct and steady and not unkind. "Now I am riding to Buckhorn Creek," he said, which was an answer and also was not an answer, and she accepted it as such. They camped that night by a creek in a grove of cottonwoods, whose leaves were turning yellow and falling in the small wind, and the sound of the water and the leaves was a pleasant combination. He showed her, without it being a lesson, how to find the particular kind of dry wood for a fire in country that looked bare of it, and she watched and filed it away, because she intended to learn everything this country could teach her. After supper she read aloud from Middlemark, which she did without especially planning to, simply because she had been reading a few pages each evening since Laramie and it was her habit, and he sat on the far side of the fire and listened with a stillness that told her he was genuinely engaged with it. When she stopped, marking her place, he said, "She writes about the inside of people very precisely." George Eliot understood that the inside of people is where the real events happen, Martha said. He looked at the fire. "Yes," he said. She studied him across the fire, this man who lived alone in the mountains and read Dickens, and said things like that about George Eliot, and she thought that he was the most surprising person she had encountered in a long time, which in the Wyoming Territory of 1873 was saying something, because the territory was not short of surprising people. She found herself wondering what he looked like when he laughed, whether he laughed, what his face might do with complete ease and happiness rather than this careful, measured steadiness. She found herself wondering about his hands, which were large and skilled and capable of delicate work, which she had observed during the axle repair. She found herself wondering, in the private honesty of her own mind, things that she then set aside because she was a widow of 6 months, and this was a practical journey, and he was a stranger she had met on the prairie 2 days ago. But she set them aside rather than dismissing them entirely, which was a distinction she noticed. The second day of travel brought them into the foothills, where the ground rose and the air changed, gaining the resinous coolness of pine forest, and the wagon road became rougher, requiring more care. He rode ahead at times to check the ground, returning to guide her around the worst of the ruts and rocks, and she let him do this without feeling that it diminished her, because there was a difference between accepting practical help from someone who knew the country better than she did and surrendering her own judgment, and she had always known the difference. They encountered in the early afternoon of that second day a small party of Shoshone travelers moving east, 2 men and an older woman, traveling light on horseback. Martha held the wagon steady and kept her hands visible and unhurried, and Elias greeted the men in what she realized with considerable surprise was Shoshone, not fluent perhaps but enough, and the exchange was brief and apparently friendly. The travelers passed without incident. "You speak Shoshone?" she asked. "Some," he said. "Enough to be respectful." She thought about this. "What did they say?" "The older man told me the North Pass has some early snow but is still passable," he said. "And he asked if you were my wife." She looked at him. "And what did you tell him?" A pause. "That you were a woman homesteading north of Buckhorn Creek," he said, "and that I was seeing you safely there." She considered the way he had phrased that, the fact that he had said what he was doing rather than what she was not, and it was a small thing, perhaps, but she found it graceful. The country the Shoshone and other native peoples of the territory had lived in for generations had been, in the decade and a half since the post-war expansion, increasingly and often violently disrupted by the movement of settlers and the enforced agreements of government treaties. Martha knew this not from first-hand experience but from newspapers and the conversations of people in Laramie, and she knew it to be a truth that the celebration of westward expansion generally preferred to omit. The land she was going to homestead on was land that people had lived on and moved through for longer than the American Republic had existed. That was not nothing. She carried the knowledge of it the way she carried most difficult truths, plainly and without looking away. "The Shoshone have lost a great deal in these territories," she said, "more than most people in the towns choose to think about." He glanced at her. "Yes," he said. He said it with the simple directness of someone who had observed it closely over years. Levesque used to say that the men who drew the treaty lines never had to live inside them. "That is true of most injustice," she said. "The people drawing the lines are never the people affected by them." He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again he said, "You are a woman who thinks about things." It was not a compliment exactly, but it was not a compliment, and it came from a man who she suspected did not produce empty flattery, which made it mean something. "I should hope I am," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it and noted it for later examination. The town of Buckhorn Creek revealed itself at the end of the second full day of travel together, appearing around a bend in the valley road, as a collection of perhaps a dozen buildings in various states of construction and weathering, strung along the creek for which the place was named. There was a general store, a livery stable, a small boarding house that also served as the nearest approximation of a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of houses in varying sizes. A sign nailed to the largest building read, "Connolly's General Store and Trading Post," in letters that had once been painted, but were now well on their way to being bare wood. It was a small, rough, honest place, and Martha looked at it with the clear eyes of someone who had no romantic illusions about frontier life, and found that she was not disappointed exactly, but rather confirmed in what she had expected. This was what there was, and she would work with it. Elias brought his mule and horse to the livery while she drove the wagon to the general store, and they conducted their separate businesses, she purchasing the additional supplies she needed for the last leg of the journey and arranging for the storeman, a compact, weathered Scotsman named Connolly, to tell her exactly what she could expect of the route north to the land she was going to. Connolly told her the road was fair for another 8 miles, then became more of a track and then something less than a track, that the creek was crossable at 2 places he marked on the rough map he drew for her on the back of a paper bag, and that her land, once she reached it, would want a winter's worth of work before it was habitable, but that the spring there was good and the timber was accessible. "There is nobody near you," Connolly said. "Not within half a day's ride in any direction." "I know that," she said. "A woman alone," he said, not unkindly but with the weight of genuine concern, "is a woman with 40 acres of good land and the means and intention to work them," she finished. He gave her a long look, and then nodded with a kind of respect that was more satisfying than reassurance would have been. Elias found her at the store, concluded his own business with Connolly for the pelts, which he stacked neatly on the counter and received fair value for in coin and credit, and they stepped outside together into the late afternoon of Buckhorn Creek's single main street, which was also its only street, and stood there in the particular awkward moment of a parting that neither of them had fully prepared for. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Your land is another half-day from here," he said. "So Connolly tells me," she said. "I plan to camp one more night and arrive tomorrow." He nodded, and she could see him weighing something, turning it over with that careful internal process of his. "I could ride with you," he said. "See you to the land. Make certain the spring is clean and the creek crossing is sound before I go up to the canyon." She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had fixed her wagon without a word and ridden 2 days beside her, and listened to George Eliot by a fire, and said things with 12 words that other men could not say with 50. She thought about the feeling of his fingers against hers on the coffee cup in the morning. She thought about the way her horses had settled, the first morning after he arrived, into a calm that they had not had before, as if they too had recognized something reliable. "I would be glad of that," she said. The final half-day was the loveliest of all of them, the road climbing gently through pine and aspen, with the mountains enormous on the left, and the valley spreading golden below on the right. And the air was so clear that she felt she could see every needle on every tree on the slopes above her. Elias rode beside the wagon and they talked more freely than they had before, as if the knowledge of the parting at the end of this leg made them more willing to spend the currency of words they had both been conserving. He told her about Levesque, more fully than he had before, about what the old man had taught him about reading weather and country and animal sign, about the particular way the mountains changed between seasons and the different faces they wore at different hours. He told it with a love for the subject that was as clear as anything she had seen in him, a warmth that he brought to the natural world that he had not brought to discussions of people or society, and she watched it in him with a kind of wonder. "You love these mountains," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "More than anything else you have known?" she asked. He looked at her. The pale eyes were very direct. "Until recently," he said, and then looked back at the road ahead, and Martha Maddox sat with that sentence for a long moment, feeling it settle into her chest like the first warmth after cold. The land, when they reached it, was everything Elias had said and everything Thomas had hoped. The spring came out of the hillside clear and cold and strong, enough water for a house and a garden and animals. The timber on the slope was good ponderosa pine, straight and well-grown. The bottomland along the creek was black soil, deep and rich, and the grass was thick and tall, the kind of grass that meant the ground held moisture well. There was a flat shelf of land, sheltered on the north by a curve of hill, that was the obvious site for a house, protected from the worst of the winter wind and facing south to catch the winter sun. She stood in the middle of it with her hands at her sides and felt something she had not felt in a long time, the specific feeling of having arrived at the right place. Elias was looking at the spring, crouching beside it, tasting the water. "Clean," he said. "No iron, no sulfur. Good water." She walked to stand beside him and looked at the water coming clear from the ground, and she thought about Thomas, who had chosen this land with care and love and had not lived to see it. She let herself feel that for a moment, fully, the grief and the gladness mixed together in the complicated way they always were when she let herself look at them directly. "It is exactly right," she said softly. Elias stood and looked at the land with her, and it was one of those moments that expand slightly in time, where the quality of the light and the smell of the air and the silence between two people hold something that language does not quite have the vocabulary for. "I will help you set up a proper camp before I go," he said. "Check the crossings, clear the site." She turned to look at him. "You have given a great deal of time to my situation," she said. "You have your own life to return to." "My cabin will wait," he said. He said it with a simplicity that meant he had decided and was not interested in being argued out of it. They worked through the afternoon, and it was good work, the kind that has a clear purpose and a visible result. He showed her where the best timber for fence posts was, what the ground was like for a foundation, where the natural drainage ran so she would not place a building in the path of spring flood water. She listened and asked sharp questions, and he answered them, and occasionally modified his own suggestions in response to her questions, which she noted with approval. He built her a proper shelter against the cold, using the canvas of her wagon top and timber from the slope, enough to keep the worst of the weather out while she built something permanent. He showed her how the woodpile should be arranged for the most protection from snow and the quickest access in cold weather. He checked every spoke on the repaired wagon wheel and pronounced it sound. As the sun dropped and the temperature fell sharply, they built a fire at the site she had chosen for her house, and she made supper, and they ate it in a silence that was no longer the silence of strangers but the silence of two people who had found, through some inexplicable process, a frequency on which they could exist comfortably together. He was going to leave in the morning. She knew that. He had his cabin to reach before the snow came in earnest, and the mountain passes were already showing white on their upper reaches, and his life was up there in that canyon, and she was here on her land, and neither of those things was going to change, and she had not come across the open prairie to fall immediately into depending on someone else. She had come to stand on her own land and be her own person. All of that was true. And also, sitting by this fire in the clean mountain air with the stars coming out over the mountains in their thousands, she was aware of a loneliness ahead of her that she had not felt before, not in Laramie, not on the journey, but which was now very present and clear, because she had had, unexpectedly, 3 days of a particular kind of company that she had not known she was capable of wanting. "Elias," she said. He looked up. "How often do you come down to Buckhorn Creek?" He thought about this. "Through the summer, every few weeks," he said. "In winter, maybe once a month if the passes are open. And in the spring, more often," he said. "When the trapping is done and the weather opens." She looked at the fire. "The trading post is half a day from here," she said. "If you come through this way." "I would come through this way," he said. His voice was careful and quiet. She looked at him. "Then perhaps you would stop," she said, "when you come through." He held her gaze for a long moment, and in his expression she could see something large and careful and genuine making its way to the surface. "I would like that," he said. It was not a declaration of anything. It was an honest, plain statement from an honest, plain man, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, the most romantic thing anyone had said to Martha Maddox in years, and she sat with it glowing quietly in her chest and watched the fire burn down. He rode out early the next morning with the gray horse and the mule, heading up the slope through the aspens toward the mountain canyon where his cabin waited, and she stood by her new spring and watched him go. and when he turned once at the tree line and raised a hand, she raised hers in return, and then the aspens took him and he was gone. She turned back to her land and got to work. The winter that followed was one of the hardest in memory in the Wyoming Territory, which was saying something, and it tested Martha Maddox's determination and practicality and physical endurance in ways she had not entirely anticipated, even knowing what she was walking into. She built the walls of her cabin with the help of 2 men from a ranch 12 miles south who came up to help her in exchange for 3 days of her provision, and her word, given freely, that she would return the labor in kind when they needed extra hands. The work went slowly because there were only 3 of them, and the timber had to be hauled, and the walls had to be notched and fitted with a precision that she demanded, because she intended the building to stand for decades, not years. The roof was the hardest part and the most critical, because a roof that failed in Wyoming winter failed catastrophically, and she spent more time on it than on anything else. And when the first November snow fell, it fell on a roof that held it properly and shed it properly and did not leak. The inside of the cabin was spare and functional, a single large room with a stone fireplace that she built herself with river stone carried from the creek, which was harder work than anything she had done before in her life, and she was proud of it with a pride that had nothing performative about it. The fireplace drew properly, which she had been more anxious about than she had let herself show, and the first time she lit it and it pulled the smoke cleanly up and out, she sat in front of it and cried, briefly and thoroughly, which was the first time she had cried since Thomas died, and it was a different kind of crying, not just grief but release, everything she had been carrying through the journey and the building and the settling, all of it moving through her at once. She wrote letters through the winter, sending them to Laramie and to her sister in Missouri on the post rider who came through Buckhorn Creek once a month when the passes allowed it. The letters were honest accounts of her situation, neither falsely cheerful nor discouraging, because she had no patience for either pretense. She told her sister the truth, that it was hard and lonely and sometimes frightening, and also the most fully alive she had felt in years, and that the land was good and the spring was clean, and she intended to stay. She thought about Elias Wallace through that winter, which she neither encouraged nor discouraged in herself. She thought about him with the same honesty she brought to everything, acknowledging that the 3 days on the trail had left a mark on her that was more than gratitude or even admiration, that there was something in the quality of his presence that had lodged in her like a splinter, not painful exactly but consistently perceptible. She did not know if she would see him again. She thought she might. She had the sense that he was not a man who said things he did not mean, and he had said he would come through this way, and she held that not as a certainty, but as a possibility she was willing to preserve carefully and not examine too often, the way you preserve a small fire in cold weather by attending to it just enough and not smothering it with too much attention. He came in March. She heard the horse first, a single horse, and she picked up the rifle as a matter of habit before she recognized the gray of the horse through the cabin window, and she put the rifle down and opened the door and stood in the frame of it with the March wind blowing cold and clean off the mountains. He looked different in the winter coat, which was heavier, and he had more beard, the way men who spend months alone in mountain country accumulate beard, but his eyes were the same pale gray-green, and they found hers immediately and held them with that same direct, unhurried quality. "You are still here," he said. "I told you I would be," she said. He swung down and tied the horse, and she stepped back so he could come in, and he came in and looked at the cabin, at the fireplace especially, with attention that she recognized as genuine assessment rather than politeness. "You built this," he said. "With help for the walls," she said. "The fireplace I built alone." He looked at it for a moment. "It is well made," he said. "That is a difficult thing to do right." "I know," she said. "Sit down, I have coffee." He sat at her table, which was one she had made herself from ponderosa planks, rough but solid and level. And she made coffee and they sat across from each other in the afternoon light coming through the cabin's two small windows. And it was strange and comfortable and strange again, because 3 months had passed and they were not the same strangers they had been, but they were not yet whatever they might be, and both of them knew it. He told her about his winter, which had been hard and good in equal measure, long months of deep cold and deep silence, and the particular richness of the mountain world in winter that he described with a precision that made her feel she had been there. She told him about the cabin building and the fireplace and the long January when the passes had closed and no word from anywhere had reached her for 5 weeks. "Were you afraid?" he asked. "Occasionally," she said. "Mostly I was busy." "I kept busy deliberately." He nodded as if this was something he understood from the inside. "I thought about coming down earlier," he said. "When the cold held in January." She looked at him. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you might not want it," he said, "to have someone check on you as if you could not manage." "You were right to wait," she said, "and wrong to think I would have minded." He looked at her across the table. The afternoon light was falling on his face and she could see in it that the careful steadiness was the surface of something much deeper and warmer, a warmth that he kept banked like a good fire, steady and long-burning rather than spectacular. "Martha," he said. He said her name for the first time and she noticed this, and she thought how a person's name sounds different in different people's mouths, how it can be a word or something more than a word. "Yes," she said. "I have been thinking about you since September," he said. He said it the way he said everything, plainly and completely, without embellishment or hedging, and it landed with the weight of something that had been considered for a long time. She held his gaze. "And I you," she said. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, the fullest silence she had sat in since she could remember, and they both let it be what it was. "I am not an easy man," he said after a while. "I know that about myself. I have lived alone a long time and I have habits of solitude that are deeply set." "I am not a simple woman," she said. "I have opinions and I intend to keep them. I have a life here that I built and I am not interested in giving it to anyone." "I would not ask you to," he said. "Then we understand each other," she said. He almost smiled, and this time it went further than almost, and she saw what his face did with a real smile, and it was, she thought, one of the finest things she had seen in a long while. He stayed 2 nights, sleeping in the lean-to shelter he helped her build outside for the horses, and they talked through both evenings as the fire burned, and the March wind tested the cabin walls and found them sound. He told her more of himself than he had told anyone, she suspected, from the way he offered it with a care that suggested it was not something he gave easily. His family in Ohio, his estrangement from his father, who had wanted a farmer and gotten a man who could not stay in one place, a rift that had never fully healed before his father died. His years on the cattle drives before the mountains, the hardness of that life and the men who lived it, some of whom had been admirable and some of whom had not, and the things he had seen that had shaped his understanding of what people were capable of in both directions. She talked, too, more than she usually talked, about her marriage to Thomas and what it had been and what it had not been, with the honesty of someone who loved the person they were speaking of, but was not interested in converting him into something he had not been. Thomas had been kind and steady and had loved her, and she had loved him, and their life had been good. It had also been quiet in a way she had sometimes felt as a weight, a sense of something in herself that had not had room, and she had never said that to anyone, and she said it now, carefully, to Elias Wallace sitting across her fireplace in March in Wyoming. He listened without speaking until she was done, and then he said, "You have a great deal of room here." She looked around her cabin, the fireplace and the rough-hewn walls and the 2 small windows and the single door. "Yes," she said. "I mean in yourself," he said, "not the cabin." She looked at him for a long moment, feeling something open slowly and completely in her chest. A door she had not known was closed. "Thank you," she said, and meant it in a way that was deeper than the words. He came back in April, and then in May, and each time he stayed longer and each time the ease between them deepened and became more specific. The kind of ease that has detail in it rather than just comfort, where you know how a person takes their coffee and what makes them quiet in a way that is thinking rather than withdrawal, and what their face does when they are engaged by something and when they are merely polite about it. In May the land was flowering, wildflowers across the bottomland meadow in colors that stopped the breath, and she had gotten her kitchen garden in, working the black soil that was everything Elias had said it would be, and the first green shoots were showing, and she stood in the garden on a May morning and felt the specific satisfaction of something growing that you have planted, which is one of the most ancient and reliable satisfactions in human experience. Elias had ridden in the evening before, and he stood at the garden's edge now watching her work, and she looked up and caught him looking at her with an expression that was no longer careful or measured, that was in fact quite open, and they looked at each other in the morning light with the flowers going on in every direction and the mountains above them wearing the green of early summer. "I would like to stay," he said. She sat back on her heels. "For how long?" she asked, though she thought she knew. "As long as you will have me," he said, "if that is what you want." She stood up, brushing the soil from her hands, and walked to where he stood, and she looked up at him because he was considerably taller than she was, and she said, "I have wanted that since October, Elias, possibly since September." He reached out and took her hands, both of them, which still had garden soil on them, and held them in his large, careful hands, and he looked at her with everything he usually kept banked and controlled now fully present on his face, warm and steady and real. "I am not much for towns," he said. "You should know that completely before anything else." "I am not much for towns either," she said. "I left the last one and have not missed it." "I would want to keep the cabin up the canyon," he said. "I would need to go there sometimes. I would want my kitchen garden and my horses and the right to disagree with you when I think you are wrong," she said. "You have all of those things regardless," he said, "but I am glad you know it. And I want you to read to me from Dickens," she said. "You mentioned Dickens, and I have never heard you talk about Dickens, and I want to hear that." And this time he laughed, a real laugh, low and quiet but a full laugh, and it was every bit as fine as she had imagined it would be. And she stood in her kitchen garden with her hands in his and felt something complete and strong and clear settling around them both, like something that had always been there, waiting for them to arrive at the same place at the same time. He proposed to her in June, at the spring on the upper end of the property, the one he had first tested and declared clean, because he said that was the place that had first felt like the two of them together in his mind. Him crouching by the water and her standing beside him, and both of them knowing, even then, that something was beginning. He did not make a great production of it, because that was not his nature, but he said it with such complete and earnest honesty that it was more romantic than any theatrical gesture could have been. "I love you, Martha," he said. "I have loved you since you lowered that rifle and said, 'All right. I want to build a life here with you if you will have me.'" She said yes before he had finished the sentence. They were married in August at Buckhorn Creek, in a ceremony conducted by a traveling Methodist minister who happened to be passing through, which Connolly at the general store had organized by sending word down the valley when he knew the minister was coming, because Connolly had observed the situation with considerable interest over the preceding months and had decided to be useful. The ceremony was witnessed by Connolly himself, his wife, a large Irish woman named Bridget who wept happily throughout, the two ranch hands who had helped Martha build her cabin walls, and a Shoshone man named Two Willows who had become, through a series of encounters at the trading post over the winter, something close to a friend of Elias, and who stood at the back of the room with the gravity and goodwill of someone who takes these occasions seriously. Martha wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had packed from Laramie with no specific occasion in mind, but which she had, she admitted to herself, taken out and looked at more than once through the winter. Her dark hair was pinned up in a way she had not taken the time for since before Thomas died. She stood at the front of Connolly's store, which had been cleared of its front shelves for the occasion, and watched Elias come to stand beside her. And he was wearing the closest thing he had to good clothes, a clean shirt and dark trousers and boots that had been polished with some effort. And his hat was in his hands, and he looked at her with everything open and present in his pale eyes, and she thought she had never in her life been so glad of any single moment. The minister spoke the words that had been spoken over couples since before either of them had been born, words about love and faithfulness and the making of a life together. And when he reached the point where he asked if there were any impediments to the union, Bridget Connolly laughed wetly into her handkerchief, and Elias looked at Martha with a gravity that was also somehow the edge of his rare smile, and Martha put her hand in his, and they said what needed to be said. The celebration afterward was small and genuine, the best kind, with Connolly's good whiskey and Bridget's remarkable pie, and conversation that was warm without being forced. And when the afternoon light came through the store windows golden and long, Martha stood beside her husband and felt, in the fullness of her heart, both Thomas's absence and Elias' presence, both the grief of what was lost and the gratitude of what had been found, and she held both of those things without pretending either one away. Elias came home to her land, which was now their land, in the way of a man who had found the place he had been looking without knowing he was looking, setting himself to it with the same thoroughness he brought to all things. He kept his cabin up the canyon and went there sometimes in the trapping season, as they had agreed, and she held that agreement as an important one, because she understood that part of loving Elias Wallace was understanding that he needed the mountains the way she needed her garden, that it was not absence of her but presence of himself, and there was a difference. In the first full year of their marriage, they built the cabin into a proper house, adding 2 rooms and improving the fireplace and cutting real windows with glass that came up from Buckhorn Creek on a freight wagon, and they did the work together side by side. And it was good work, the best kind, the kind that produces something permanent that bears both your names. The kitchen garden tripled in size. Elias showed her, that first full growing season, where the soil was best and where the drainage was good and how to manage the irrigation from the spring. And she showed him, because she had been learning all winter from every book and pamphlet she could find, the best planting combinations and the management of the soil for long-term fertility. They argued about several decisions with the engaged and honest argument of 2 people who both know things and neither of whom is willing to simply defer. And the arguments always ended in a decision that was better than either of them had begun with, which they both knew and were quietly pleased about. Elias read to her in the evenings from Dickens, from Scott, from whatever books the Trading Post or Freight Travelers produced, and she read to him, and they talked about what they read with the same quality of conversation they had had over the fire on the prairie in September, which had deepened with time into something richer and more layered, but remained essentially the same. 2 people whose minds engaged each other in a way that neither of them had expected to find. By the 2nd year she was pregnant, which she had hoped for and was not entirely surprised by, and she continued working her land through the pregnancy in the practical way of frontier women, who could not afford the genteel invalidity that women in eastern cities were sometimes advised toward. Elias was, in this as in other things, both deeply attentive and respectfully unsmothering, checking on her without hovering, doing the heaviest work without making a point of it, watching her with a love that had in it both great tenderness and great respect for her competence. Their son was born in early March, in the cabin, with Bridget Connolly in attendance, who had ridden up 2 days before when the signs suggested the birth was near and who was, it turned out, a woman of considerable experience in these matters and a great deal more useful than she was at most others. The birth was hard but not dangerous, the usual ordeal of first births, and Elias waited outside through most of it, which was the custom, pacing with the particular barely controlled anxiety of a man who is very good at managing his own fear, and was at that moment at the edge of his capacity. When Bridget opened the door and told him he had a son, he went inside and sat beside Martha, who was exhausted and fierce and entirely herself, and held his son for the first time with the careful precision of a man who had handled many delicate things but none quite this delicate. And his face was completely unguarded in that moment, every wall down, and Martha watched him hold their son, and felt the world settle into a shape that she had not known she was hoping for until it arrived. They named him Thomas Elias Wallace, Thomas for the man who had first chosen this land, and whom they owed a debt of gratitude that could not be paid except by living well on what he had started, and Elias for the man who had repaired a broken wagon in the middle of nowhere, and thereby, entirely without intending to, repaired a great deal more than that. Thomas Elias Wallace was a good baby and became a good child, with his father's steady nature and his mother's sharp curiosity, a combination that made him simultaneously calming and relentlessly interesting to be around. He grew up knowing every inch of the land, guided by a father who could read the mountains and a mother who could make the soil give everything it had, and he was a child who was both free and rooted, which is the best possible combination. Their daughter came 2 years later in May, which Martha said was the right month for her, because she arrived with the wildflowers and had something of their quality about her, bright and unassuming and possessed of a beauty that was entirely its own. They named her Clara, after Martha's mother, and Clara was from her first moments a person of definite character who had strong opinions about everything and was not shy about expressing them, which meant she was destined for interesting things. And there was a third child 3 years after that, another son, whom they named James, a solid and joyful child who seemed from birth to find existence particularly delightful, and who grew up in the way of youngest children who are surrounded by competent and loving people, with a generosity of spirit that made everyone around him feel better. The land they had built on gave back to them everything they put into it, the black soil of the bottomland yielding good vegetables and in later years grain, the spring never faltering, the timber on the slope providing what they needed for building and fuel without ever being taken faster than it could grow. Elias managed the timber with the same long-term attention he brought to everything, taking from the forest with an eye to what it needed to replenish, a view he had gotten partly from Levesque and partly from years of watching what happened to places where people took without thinking. The relationship between them deepened as years accumulated the way good relationships do, not growing easier exactly, because love between two strong-minded people is never precisely easy, but growing richer and more specific, adding layers of shared history and private language, and the intricate knowledge of another person that comes only from sustained, honest attention. They fought sometimes, as people do, with the full engagement of two people who were both completely present in the relationship and were not afraid of each other's displeasure. And they resolved those fights in the way of people who had long ago decided that the relationship was more important than being right, which did not mean either of them ever simply surrendered a position they genuinely held, but meant that they could argue fiercely and return to each other without the argument leaving damage. Connolly retired from the trading post when Martha and Elias had been married 6 years, selling it to a younger man from Denver named Hargrove, who was competent if not as colorful, and Connolly and Bridget moved to a smaller house in the settlement and became fixtures of the community in the way of people who have been central to a place, and do not simply vacate that position when they vacate their professional role. Bridget continued to attend births and offer opinions and make remarkable pie, and Connolly continued to know everything about everyone and dispense quiet and useful advice to those who sought it. They came to the Wallace homestead for Christmas each year, which became a tradition that all parties valued. 2 willows came occasionally through the years, passing through the valley on various travels, and he and Elias always talked for a long time when he did, and Martha fed him well and was glad to see him, and the children learned to know him as a person of significance and interest who had known their father before their father was their father. He told Thomas, when the boy was 8, about the day he had seen Elias on the trail with the woman in the wagon, which Martha heard from across the fire and pretended not to hear, though she listened carefully, because she had never heard it from that angle. Two Willows said he had told his companions that something was happening between those two, though they were acting as if nothing was. He said it with the satisfaction of a man who had been proven correct. He was right, Martha said, from across the fire, where she had been pretending to read. Elias looked at her with the smile that still, after all these years, did something particular to the quality of her attention. He was right, Elias agreed. The trading post grew over the years into something more properly called a town, with a school eventually and a proper church, and a doctor who came from Cheyenne and decided to stay, and Buckhorn Creek became a real place rather than simply a collection of structures, with the particular life of a community that has built itself through the combined effort of people who intend to remain. Martha was a part of that community in the active and practical way that came naturally to her, attending the meetings about the school, contributing her knowledge to discussions about the practical management of the land and water, offering the perspective of someone who had worked her own land with her own hands for years and had the specific, earned knowledge that this produced. She taught her children to read early and well, and when the school came, she was one of the first to support the teacher, a young woman from Ohio named Miss Aldrich who arrived with good education and no practical experience of frontier life, and whom Martha took under her practical wing while being careful not to condescend, which was a balance she navigated successfully. Elias still went up to the canyon in the trapping season, though less often as the years passed, and the children grew, and the demands of the land increased. He went because it was still part of himself, because the mountain still called him in that original, essential way, and Martha understood this and was glad he had it, because she had seen men who had given up the parts of themselves that were essential and become diminished by the giving up, and she had no interest in a diminished Elias. She wanted all of him, including the parts she could not entirely share. When he came back from those trips, he always brought something: a good piece of timber, a specific herb she had mentioned needing, once a book that a passing trapper had been carrying and had been willing to trade for supplies, a collected volume of essays by Emerson that she read through twice in a winter and argued with and loved. He brought these things without ceremony, placing them quietly where she would find them, which was so entirely him that it made her smile every time. On their 10th anniversary, which they marked with a dinner that included all the children and both Connollys and was generally excellent, Elias presented her with something he had made through the previous winter, which was a writing desk, crafted from the finest piece of ponderosa pine he had found over years, fitted together with the precision of a man who had given it serious thought and time. It had a lift-top lid with a brass fitting and a small drawer and 2 little shelves for books, and it was, in its clean and functional beauty, the most beautiful piece of furniture she had ever owned. She stood looking at it for a moment, her hand on the smooth wood, and she was not able to speak for a moment, which happened to her rarely. "You made this," she said. "This winter," he said, "while you were planning the spring planting. You never said anything. I wanted it to be right before I showed it," he said. She turned and looked at him, this man she had been married to for 10 years, and she thought about the first time she had seen him ride out of the timber toward her broken wagon on a September morning. This large, quiet man with his mule and his tools and his complete absence of theatrics, and she thought about everything that had followed, every day and season and difficulty and joy of the decades since, and she felt the weight and richness of it all, the accumulation of a life together. "Elias," she said. "Yes," he said. "I am deeply in love with you," she said. "I want you to know that with complete clarity. Not in the complicated way that life usually delivers things, but simply and entirely." He looked at her with everything open, the way he had looked at her over the wedding vows in Connolly's store, with that complete absence of barrier that he brought only to her. "Martha," he said, "I have been in love with you since you stood in that prairie dust with your rifle and your spine straight as a fence post, and looked at me like you were going to solve me the way you solve every other practical problem." She laughed, a full and genuine laugh, and he was smiling, that real smile that remained one of her favorite things in her world. "I did not solve you," she said. "No," he said. "You did something better. You showed me how to be here." She went to him, and he put his arms around her, and outside the windows the Wyoming mountains were brilliant with October color, the aspens going gold against the dark pine, the high peaks dusted with the first snow of the season, and in the house behind them 3 children were engaged in various states of noisy existence, and the fire was good, and the spring was clean, and the land was theirs, and none of it had been easy, and all of it had been worth it. That winter Elias read aloud from Bleak House through the long evenings while the snow came down outside, and the fire held its steady light, and Martha sat at her writing desk and wrote letters, and in a small leather journal kept notes on the growing seasons and the land and the particular quality of the light at different times of year, because she had found that writing things down was a way of honoring them, of saying that they were worth the attention. She wrote, on one of those winter evenings while Elias read and the children were asleep, a brief account of the day in September of 1873, when her wagon axle had broken on the Wyoming prairie, and a man had ridden out of the mountains and fixed it without being asked. She wrote it plainly, in the direct style that was hers, without embellishment, and she ended it with the following observation, which she felt was both accurate and sufficient: that the breaking of that axle, which had seemed at the time to be a catastrophe, had in fact been the hinge on which her entire life had turned, and that she had spent considerable time since wondering at the way the worst moments sometimes carry inside them the seeds of the best ones, not because suffering is necessary or noble, but simply because life moves through disruption, and when it does, if you keep your spine straight and your eyes open, you sometimes find yourself standing in exactly the right place. Elias looked up from Bleak House. "What are you writing?" he asked. "History," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Whose?" "Ours," she said. He nodded and returned to Dickens, and Martha returned to her journal, and outside the snow fell on the mountains and the land and the spring and the garden, on the house they had built together and the life they had made, and all of it held through the winter and was green again in the spring, as it was every year, as it would continue to be. 3 more springs followed, and 3 more winters, each with its own particular character and its own particular demands. And in all of them, the Wallace household met what came with the combination of practicality and genuine love that had come to define it. James, the youngest, fell out of a tree at age 6 and broke his arm in a way that required the doctor from town, who came up and set it properly and accepted payment in a cord of split firewood, which was agreed by both parties to be a fair trade. Thomas, the eldest, showed at age 11 a talent for the kind of careful, observational intelligence that his father had, spending hours watching animal behavior in the meadow and the creek and producing, in his young person's handwriting, observations of considerable accuracy and detail that his mother collected carefully, because she suspected they would matter to him later. Clara developed, with her mother's quiet encouragement and the school's formal instruction, into a reader of voracious appetite and a writer of striking clarity for her age, who was going to do things in the world that the world had not yet seen. On a clear April morning when their eldest was 13, Elias came home from the canyon with a young man beside him, one of the sons of the ranching family to the south, who had gotten himself into difficulty on the mountain trail and been found by Elias and brought down, and in the process of feeding this young man and seeing him rested and returned to his family. Martha watched Elias manage the situation with the same quiet competence that had first impressed her on a September morning a decade and more ago, and she felt the love she bore him as a completely physical sensation, a warmth that was also a kind of anchor, the feeling of knowing exactly where you are. The homestead north of Buckhorn Creek became, over the years, one of the most productive small holdings in the valley, known for the quality of its kitchen garden produce and the integrity of its owners. People made the half-day ride from Buckhorn Creek occasionally when they needed advice of a practical kind, because both Martha and Elias had the kind of knowledge that came from doing things for a long time with serious attention, and they gave it freely, because they understood that a community was built from the accumulation of people's willingness to help each other. The land that Thomas Maddox had chosen with his characteristic care, standing on a hillside in Wyoming and looking at a spring and a creek and a stand of good timber, and knowing, with the farmer's instinct, that this was land worth having, had become what he had hoped it would become. Martha thought of him sometimes, especially in the garden, especially in the spring when the soil first turned and gave up that deep, dark smell of life beginning again. She thought of him with love and gratitude and the kind of honest memory that does not either idealize or diminish, and she was glad that the land he had chosen was being used and loved and made into something permanent. She was 43 years old when she wrote the final entry in her land journal for that season, putting the pen down and closing the leather cover, and outside it was September again. September in Wyoming, with the aspen going gold on the mountain slopes and the air carrying the first real cold of autumn. Elias was bringing in firewood, and she could hear the steady rhythm of the splitting. And the children, who were not small children any longer, were about their various purposes. Thomas helping with the wood, Clara at her books, James somewhere on the property doing whatever James was doing at any given moment, which was usually something that made sense when you found out what it was. She stood at the window of the house they had built together and looked out at the mountains, which were always magnificent in September, and she felt the completeness of the life she was standing in, not perfection, because nothing is perfect, but completeness, the sense that everything is present and accounted for and real. Elias came through the door with an armful of wood, which he stacked by the fireplace with his usual efficiency, and then he looked up and saw her at the window and came to stand beside her, following her gaze to the mountains. "What are you looking at?" he asked. "September," she said. He looked at her, understanding everything she meant by that, and he took her hand, which he did naturally now, the gesture of someone who has held this particular hand for years and knows its weight and shape and the warmth it carries. "Are you glad you did it?" he asked. "Crossed the territory alone, came to this land." She turned to look at him, this man who had been the best and most sustaining surprise of her life, and she thought about the broken axle in the dust and the way he had ridden out of the timber and set himself to the work of fixing it without being asked or thanked or given any reason to expect anything from her, simply because a wagon needed fixing and he had the means to fix it. "Yes," she said, "and I will tell you exactly when I knew it was the right decision." "When?" he said. "When you rode out of those trees," she said. "I did not know it then in the way I know it now, but yes, that moment. When you looked at my broken wagon and then at me and there was nothing in your face but the intention to help, that was when." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was feeling something fully before he spoke it. "Martha," he said. "Yes," she said. "That is the finest thing you have ever said to me," he said, "and you have said many fine things." She leaned against him and looked at the mountains and felt the house around her, the fireplace she had built with her own hands, and the desk he had made from the finest pine in the canyon, and the life between those two pieces of the story, the gardens and the children and the winters and the springs, and all the small, ordinary, remarkable daily life of two people who had chosen each other and kept choosing each other, as you do, every single day. The fire was laid and ready. The evening was coming on. The mountains were burning gold and orange in the last light of September, and inside the house were the voices of her children and the smell of good wood, and the warmth of a home that had been made from the broken pieces of something and had become, in the making, something whole. She had come across the open prairie alone with a broken axle and a stubborn heart, and a rifle she had not needed to fire, and she had arrived exactly where she was supposed to be. That was enough. It was more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.